Hello everyone. I wanted to talk about all of the books I've read in 2021, or I've read the most amount of stuff I've ever read in 1 year. However, Danny, why are you filming it all in one video? Easy answer. I did not read many books for fun. All of the things that I read were 1000% for school. Let's talk about all of the books that I've read for fun this year. I started it off by reading Legend and Prodigy by Mary Lou. I literally just found out about the Realm of Ruins nonsense, so just wanted to say, of course, that changes my opinion of the author, but the Legend series is always going to hold a special place in my heart. 2012, 2014 YA dystopian, when that was a thing, that in a dystopian future, the US is divided in a civil war. The book takes place in LA in a militaristic. June is the Republic's darling and a child prodigy. Day is the Republic's most wanted criminal, and their paths cross when June's brother is murdered and Day is the prime suspect. This book has enemies to lovers, wholesome families in a YA 2012-2014 book, and then a teenage heartthrob of an MC. Let me tell you, the chokehold Day had on 12-year-old me. If you're a teenage girl and you read Legend and you don't have a crush on Day, I'm not saying you're wrong, but you're not right either. I told myself I was gonna reread the Legend series so that I could finally read Rebel by Mary Lou, which is the 4th book in the final installment in the series. I only finished the first 2. I couldn't bring myself to read Champion because I know what happens. There should be most likely a happy ending in Rebel, but just rereading Champion again, I couldn't do it. I couldn't take my heart out willingly and then just stomp on it again. So I didn't finish the series, nor have I read Rebel yet, even though it's been out for 3 years now. And now I have to reread Rebel because Legend finally got a TV show. Only took us a whole decade, right? The Legend fandom, we are small but mighty. I'm sure I'll read it eventually. I need to be ready to cry. And here's the thing, I don't cry in a lot of books, but Mary Lou is the only author that has ever made me cry, and I need to be prepared, and I'm not prepared. If you're looking for like what is the fandom that first got you into fandom culture, it's Legend. I remember when there was no fan art of any of the characters. The only fan art was literally from the author herself. Don't cite the deep magic to me, which I was there when it was written. Look, I love the series so much. I can't be unbiased when I'm reviewing it. Rereading Legend and Prodigy was just fantastic. And I can recognize now that it's not the height of literature, but I can still appreciate it for what it is, even if it lacks a sort of god-tier technical execution that a lot of the books that I read nowadays can oftentimes boast. But it helped me personally. Recommend it to you if you just want a nice, fun YA read to just kind of take your mind off of the nonsense happening in our world. Or maybe it's a dystopian. You want to think about the nonsense happening in our world. I would also recommend this to young teenage girls because of Day being a heartthrob. Tender is the Flesh by Agustina Bastarrica. I've been learning Spanish for 5 years. I still can't roll my R's. Like a dystopian horror set in Argentina. Basically, a virus has infected all of the animals and no one can eat meat anymore. Cannibalism becomes legalized. The main character, our narrator, is a man who works at a human meat slaughterhouse, kind of the boss around the place, and his personal life isn't going pretty great either. His wife left him, his father has Alzheimer's or dementia, and his son unfortunately passed away. All of a sudden, someone drops off female pure breed on his property and he doesn't know what to do with her. This is obviously a dystopian horror. It's a translated work and some truly horrific imagery with that eye scene. I think I found the type of horror that I like. I love the book. The grotesque imagery, the one scene with the eye socket, the characters were real, vivid, and flawed. The world building was incredible. The control of language was just... the censorship, the violence on female bodies without, in my opinion, it being overly gratuitous. Wealth and corruption, all of these being incredibly important themes. And the author comments on them within the narrative without it being too heavy-handed. Also, this book has one of the best last lines I've ever read, and A lot of people that read this book share that same opinion. Content warning, obviously, for violence. It's set in a human meat house, so trigger warning for sexual assault. Next one was The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. Rin is this poor girl from the provinces, and she works her ass off to pass the Keiju. It's this incredibly difficult test, but only 15% pass. It's set in this presumably Chinese-inspired world, and she attends one of the top academies. Then she finds out that she has shamanic powers. So I was hesitant to read this book because I was told that it is very much inspired by the historical atrocities that Japanese people inflicted upon Southeast Asia during World War II. Comfort Woman, the Bataan Death March. It's horrific. I saw a lot of Southeast Asian readers reading this and kind of breaking down because it's one of the first few times they might have seen proper representation of what happened to our ancestors, because ancestral veneration is such an important part of our cultures. So I was cautious when I was reading through it, and yeah, it does hit different when your ancestors have gone through the same horrific treatment that some of the characters in this book do. And that is something that I don't think that a lot of the white reviewers understand. I did enjoy it though. Like, I can recognize objectively that the book was written incredibly strong. The world building was fantastic, the characterization, the arcs, perfection, imagery, the themes, perfect. Loved it. And I do, of course, appreciate the way that the author commented on the toxicity within Asian communities and our values. I would obviously just warn that if you are Southeast Asian, honestly, do be careful. I was careful when I was going into it, and I am thankful that I did get those warnings beforehand. I wish I had the privilege of being able to say, oh, I just couldn't relate to it. If I couldn't relate to it, at least my ancestors did, and I felt their experience too. It did pull me out of the story oftentimes, not to say that that's a bad thing. I did not read this with an unbiased perspective. Can definitely recognize that this book was good if you're into fantasy and definitely want to read more diverse work. I recommend this. I would recommend this also if you grew up within an Asian household and there's plenty of culture and pressure. Next book, Cemetery Boys by Aiden Tommen. Yadriel is a trans boy struggling to find acceptance within his brujo family. To prove himself, he accidentally summons the ghost of Julian Diaz, the bad boy of their school. Together, they work to solve the murder of Yadriel's cousin, and so that Julian can eventually pass onto the afterlife peacefully, or else his soul will turn vengeful or violent. This book is definitely like an own voices. There's brujo magic, familial conflict, intergenerational trauma, that kind of thing. I recognize that this book helped a lot of people. I've never read another book from the point of view of a brown trans man. The representation, obviously, god tier. If you love this book for the representation, I don't want to take that away from you, but I don't want my dislike of the book to take away from someone else's enjoyment. A large part of the novel was the mystery, and unfortunately, I instantly correctly guessed everything that was going to happen throughout the book right away, which is not good. And apparently I'm not the only one. When I was reading some of the reviews, the author thought that I wouldn't have gotten it. Frankly, it feels a bit insulting. You know, it's like when the author talks down to the reader, that kind of thing. That's how I felt. I definitely related to the characters, but surprisingly I couldn't care for them, and I don't know why I couldn't get into it. Like, the dialogue was clunky at times, and that pulled me out of the story. Maritza is one of the side characters, and I understand that she was supposed to be like a loved character and like the comedic relief a lot of the times, but every time Maritza talked, I don't know why I found her so annoying, but I did. Maybe it was the narrator in the audiobook that I read that made Maritza's voice sound so grating. This book was marketed as a fantasy, but it focused extensively on the romance, to the point where I almost wish that it was just a romance book with fantastical elements within it. Romance is not my personal cup of tea. Found myself betrayed, and I get it, the author most likely had little to no hand in the say of the marketing of this book. However, those were my own expectations going into it. I went into this book expecting fantasy and magic, Instead, we got scenes that only forwarded Yadriel's and Julian's relationship. And I'm not saying that a book has to be packed with high action scenes to be interesting. What I'm saying is that there could have been more interesting scenes that also helped advance the romantic subplot. Speaking of that romantic subplot took a large portion of the book. But instead, we got scenes of Yadriel and Julian just hanging out in his bedroom. They're walking, now they're at school, then the main conflict gets kicking again. Yes, like books with high action, you oftentimes do need to give writers a chance to breathe within certain scenes. There was little to no action to warrant the amount of breaks, let alone how long these pauses went. The conflict? What conflict? The reader is meant to believe that there's this evil bad guy who wants to take over the world and is killing brujos and brujas within the community. All of the responsibility is left in the hands of these few teenagers. And I'm down with that premise. However, they never cared about it. Because of that, the reader couldn't, or I couldn't, get a personal gist of like, why are we doing all of this for? Why is it so important? This can't be as important if Yadriel and Julian are still going to a party, and then again, that party scene, I felt like it was just an excuse to have Yadriel and Julian have alone time and have a deep emotional talk. Again, I think there could have been more interesting scenes that also advanced the romantic subplot. Like, the conflict always seemed so passive within this book. I think there could have been better if they made the romance the main plot and that took place in a fantastical setting that just happens to be the backdrop. Or maybe they could have written an entirely different book that embraced a fantastical subplot. This book is meant to be a fantasy book, but it should have been a romance book, frankly. The author couldn't figure out which one it wanted to be or which one to focus on. Both of them fell weak. I think my general feelings about this book are simply meh. And meh isn't bad. It was a good meh, which is why I gave it 3 out of 5. Obviously, own voices is incredibly important. I would recommend it to people who do enjoy YA, also want to read more books from Hispanic authors. The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Mevo. Here's the thing about this book. I would be lying if I told you I remember a single thing from this book. Shall we try together? It's a Chinese-inspired fantasy. It takes place in the underworld. There's a maid and a queen. And I do remember there being like a sapphic thing. So I'm assuming it's between the maid and the queen. Although I don't think they ever really hooked up. I think it was like an emotional affair. I think one of them was a rabbit. It's a novella. That's literally all I remember about it. A lot of people love this book. I retained not a single word from this. If anything, the only proof that I did read this book was that I wrote it down. And I can't even say that this book was so bad that it was so unmemorable. I literally can't remember a single thing from this book. So we're just gonna skip to the next book. So August is this 23-year-old woman who has moved to New York to finish her undergrad. Then she meets this gorgeous girl on the train, only to find out that this gorgeous girl, she is trapped on the train and is lost in time. She's actually from the 70s, and they have to figure out a way to get her out. This is a sapphic romance. It's set in New York, and there's a lot of quirky roommate. I think what I'm learning from reviewing last year's books is that I should just not read TikTok books anymore, or even just read romance, honestly. The first thing that bugged me in this book was the main character, which admittedly is not the greatest place to start. I am someone that values discipline within a person. I very much admire someone doing a lot of work to get to achieve their goals and their dreams. August is not one of those people, and she did little to no assignments from her school, and she still managed to pass. What really set me off, she works in this diner, this like pancake diner, and she called in sick to work for weeks. She called in sick to work for weeks when she wasn't even sick. And then she also, at one point, she had the audacity to come in when she was off from work, not looking sick at all, like not trying to hide it at all. And then, even worse of all, she still, like, they didn't fire her. August, why? Thing is, though, that I hated it because I have been in the other waitress's shoes. that hit a personal chord. I have been the other waitress that someone has called. Like, I can forgive my coworkers for calling in fake sick a couple times because they wanted to go out to a party or they wanted to investigate the mysterious disappearance of this one girl on a subway train. But the fact that August did that for a whole week, there were no consequences to her actions. Oh my gosh, who does that? And it reminded me so much of the way that like the self-insert fanfiction character that can do no wrong, like they treat everyone like shit, but then they're never the one at fault. It felt like that, and that pulled me out of the writing and the story, obviously, and it felt incredibly elementary. My god, how can you have a horrible fucking character be the protagonist and you expect me to like her? But if you want to fuck up your fellow coworkers, fuck you. No sympathy. No, done. Additionally, how do you go like weeks without working? And she says that she's like a broke college student. How do you go weeks without working and she's still able to pay her New York rent? I was rooting for August's downfall throughout the entire thing. If I had her as a coworker. So that's my own personal bias. And let's talk about the romantic love interest, Jane. She's a brown Asian woman and she has little to no agency throughout the entire book. She had little to no action in her involvement of their top secret plan. If anything, August literally has to convince Jane to go through the plan so that August could save her and bring her out of this time loop. And it felt weird to have a white woman who has no consequences to her actions additionally having to save a brown Asian woman. Anyway, I'm just gonna say that it felt weird. The psychic distance throughout this entire book, wonky as hell. August sometimes feels very distant, and it almost seems like the narrative from first person to omniscient third. It's jarring. I would have DNF'd this book had it not been an audiobook. I think I read it in one sitting while I was deep cleaning the house. The reason why I think that this book became so popular is because sapphics have little to no representation in YA fiction. Like, honestly, the bar is set to hell, and the sapphic community will take anything. And good for you. I did not like this book. Next book that I read is Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson. Lillian is this nanny to these two kids from, I think he's a senator. He looks after the senator's bastard twins. The thing about these kids is that they literally catch on fire when they get stressed out. The cover is not a metaphor. If that's not an interesting premise, I don't know what is. This book is the epitome of a found family trope. This book, despite the wildness of the premise and the overall plot, it still felt like a nice sigh of relief. The characters were flawed yet interesting. The setting, the imagery, fantastic. The themes, though, is what really got me. It's just a nice little book about found family. Nothing wrong with that. I loved it. It's just a solid, good book, like a sigh of relief. And then I read Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke by Eric LaRocca. I did manage to get my hands on this sapphic horror book, and yes, it is another TikTok book. It's a novella where these two girls start an online relationship after they meet in a chat room. Then they start this BDSM relationship that quickly turns downhill. This is a sapphic horror. It has an interesting narrative, truly gag-worthy imagery with the meat scene. The thing about this book is that it's written in a narrative from like found footage, and I've never read found footage, like a found footage story, through the medium of literature, of writing, and that was super interesting. And the way that the author did it, he added so much imagery and so much description in the chat logs that are the proof. The way that he did it made it sound so natural, and it wasn't jarring at all. I do wish, though, that we did get to see more of how these two girls' relationship sort of grew and flourished, because everything moved incredibly quickly. And yes, I'm aware it's a novella. There's not a lot of word count available for that. Wish there was more seeing how these two characters interact in order to really earn the gut-punching ending that happens at the end of this book. I think that this book did an okay job trying to explore just how vulnerable LGBT people are online, especially if that's the only safe space where they feel comfortable. A lot of people dislike this book because it was like too gross and it went way too far. It's a psychological horror book. Like, I don't know what they expected. So if you wanted to read this, don't say I didn't warn you. I read I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid. A woman is on a road trip to meet the boyfriend's family, but during that whole trip, she's thinking of ending things. It's another psychological horror, and unreliable narrators, and the female character is relatable. The reason why the summary of this is so short, I did not understand what happened throughout the book. I read it. I understand what happens on the surface, but it's one of those books where like you have to think about it. My brain couldn't load. I read it during finals. I was analyzing other books as well. My reading comprehension at that time, out the fucking window, right? I just didn't get it. Now I do though, but I had to use Reddit to help me about this book. I love the atmosphere. The feeling of tension and dread was fantastic. You know that feeling when you feel like someone's like something or someone is in the corner of your eye and you keep turning and there's nothing? That's what it felt like when I was watching it. The plot went way over my head. I'm very short, so I don't blame it, but maybe that's a count on me for reading the audiobook, especially during finals when I was half paying attention. But if you're gonna read this, it is a genuinely fantastic horror. It's a psychological horror, which is my favorite, but I would just recommend that you read it on the page so that if you get confused, you can reread passages and maybe you can annotate them to truly understand what happened. This is a long video. However, let's talk about the last book that I read in 2021, and that is Planet Barbarians Book 1 by Ruby Dixon. Okay, it went viral on TikTok again. This woman is abducted and then she gets stranded on this ice planet. Then she meets this blue alien barbarian man, promises to take care of her, and they fall in love and they have a lot of sex. If you want to have an alien kink, obviously I think you'll enjoy this. If you have a breeding kink, which I did not expect, but there's a lot of breeding kink stuff in there. A female MC and an erotica with a surprising amount of personal agency, and it also feeds into the female fantasy of having a man just respect you. So why did I read this? Morbid curiosity, frankly. We learned this time and time again. I keep reading romance and erotica, but I keep getting disappointed. But I did not with this one. I love this book. Look, I went into this book expecting the worst, but I walked out of it having had a great time. Don't get me wrong, this book is not my personal cup of tea. It doesn't mean I can't enjoy it for what it is, and what it is just a fun ride, pun intended. Look, I think that Ruby Dixon used the magic, not the magic system, it's not a fantasy, it's sci-fi. The sci-fi equivalent of a magical system. Used the world building, she used the vagueness to her benefit and not to her detriment. I find that impressive. She kept it vague enough that she still had wiggle room to sort of move around. The alien's anatomy, just the physical anatomy of this alien. I'm just saying, if you are a straight woman, very similar to some things that I've seen before. How do I say this to make this YouTube friendly? Also, there's a pretty solid plot in this romance book, which is uncommon with a lot of smutty books. Like, it's not, I don't think it's just smut for the sake of smut. Not to say that there's anything wrong with it, but if you wanted to take a foray into erotica and you don't want to read just smut, maybe you need a plot to kind of ease you in. Fuck's sake, Danny. People who are shitting on this book, I don't think that the author ever meant for it to be taken seriously. It's not the height of literature. It's just a fun book. It's like the equivalent of watching Emily in Paris. You just want to turn your brain off for a little bit. It's not meant to be like Queen's Gambit level. It's just Emily in Paris shit. Just turn your brain off for a bit. It doesn't make it any less valuable, because a lot of people love this book. What I have learned, though, is that while sapphic women are desperate for representation, straight women are desperate for emotionally mature men that they would rather fucking alien. I will say, though, that this book does have 2 SA scenes. One of them entertains a common female fantasy. The other one is just a gratuitous and violent group activity that men did on one woman. So look up the content warnings if you're curious. I do share the common belief that with a lot of other reviewers that first SA scene was just, it didn't need to be there. I have read other reviews that she talks about the effects of trauma throughout the entire series in a surprisingly nuanced way for an erotica book. I can't say from personal experience, but that's what I've read from a lot of the reviews. Would I recommend this book? Only if you are going into it fully knowing that you're just there to turn off your brain, because that's the only way you're gonna find enjoyment in it. Thank you so much for watching. This is all the books I've read for fun, and I look forward to reading more this year. You can find all of my socials in the description. Please subscribe. I'm trying to post videos every Monday at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. My next video is going to be documenting my 6-hour midterm that I did in one fucking sitting. And thank you so much for watching. Okay, bye.